Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Happy Friday. Our team was just
Happy
chatting before you
Friday.
all joined the call. Thanksgiving is quickly approaching, and like Deb said, we don't know where all the time went. So I'm sure many of you feel that way too.
It's crazy.
Oh, goodness.
Good
All
morning.
right.
Good
Well,
morning.
we'll go ahead and just give it another minute or so for the rest of the group to join us, and then we'll launch right into class this morning.
Leanne, how's the donkey?
You know, that darn little thing still has not given me a baby. So everybody come on out and we'll do a group walk
Oh,
or
my goodness.
something.
All right. I feel like I just walked into some bizarre conversation and there's a donkey.
I have a donkey who's set to birth, but she's been set to birth for, gosh, guys, what, a couple months now. So we're at the end here, I hope. Vet says we're still going strong, so it's just a matter of when she's ready.
Okay, how long are
Wow.
they supposed to gestate?
12 to 14 months.
Oh, my gosh.
It's a little big
Wow.
variable.
Yeah.
Wow. That's crazy. That's wild. That's exciting.
It is.
Well, if you guys are lucky, you might get a peacock sighting out my window here today.
Very nice.
We have wild peacocks that roam.
Wow. Where are you at, Deborah?
I'm in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Yeah, really close to the Rio Grande, and it's sort of a agricultural section of town, just north of Old Town. If you've been to Albuquerque, and yeah, there's a lot of different stories as to how the peacocks got here. They're not native; they were imported by someone, but now they're wild.
Kind of like the roosters in Hawaii.
Yeah, and the chickens in where are those on Hawaii? A lot of wild chickens and roosters.
There you
Yeah.
go. All right. Well, I think it's 9:02. I want to be mindful of everyone's time, and we can just launch into our course announcements and an introduction of your facilitator, Deborah, for this morning. So welcome back. Tonight, we'll be focusing on our first session of our strategic governance in the CEO module. We've got a jam-packed presentation lined up for everybody this morning. But before we launch into that, Eric, I want to hand the floor over to you for any updates from Beach Fleshman.
Thanks, Cassandra. Yeah, I wanted to use my time this morning to talk about a partnership that we have with a company called Silent Sector. They offer cybersecurity services as well as other IT services, and we have a joint venture with that organization, so we can actually offer nonprofit organizations very affordable cybersecurity solutions now. So if that's something you'd be interested in, please reach out. Happy Thanksgiving to everybody. I can't believe I'm saying that, but happy Thanksgiving, and hopefully we have a donkey to see when we come back next time together.
Love it. Thank you, Eric. All right, I will go ahead and introduce Deborah, and we will launch into our presentation. So Deborah Thompson is a nonprofit professional with 30 years of experience leading and working with mission-based organizations. She's passionate about advancing the nonprofit sector through principles of servant leadership, good governance and accountability, and developing the next generation of nonprofit leaders who will champion missions that are vital to our community. Deborah has professional experience working with a broad range of small grassroots and large national nonprofits. She enjoyed a 14-year career with Make-A-Wish America, where she served as a national vice president responsible for chapter performance, mission delivery, leadership, and governance effectiveness across the U.S. In this role, she also served as interim CEO and board officer for local chapters undergoing turnarounds and facilitated board governance training efforts nationwide. Deborah subsequently joined New Pathways for Youth as its first chief operating officer, where she helped develop the organization's expansion strategy and became a volunteer mentor. Deborah holds a master's degree in organizational management from the University of Phoenix and a BA in American Studies from Trinity College. She received a certificate in nonprofit executive leadership from the Lodestar Center, a certificate in strategic perspectives in nonprofit management from Harvard Business School, and a certificate in interim executive leadership from Third Sector Company. She is a member of BoardSource, the Arizona Association of Nonprofits, and the International Coach Federation. And with that, Deborah, it's my pleasure to hand the floor over to you this morning. Take it away.
Well, I'm really excited to be here. There's probably need to update that bio a little bit, but thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited to again have the opportunity to teach this course and to work with this group. It's one of my favorite things that ASU does in terms of really helping prepare nonprofit leaders for the crazy ride that you're going to have or already are having with your organizations. Where my bio leaves off with New Pathways for Youth, I actually left there in 2019 to start my own business, where I do board consulting, teach with ASU, and I also became an executive coach. And I did that because I really, after 30 some years in working with nonprofits and working for nonprofits, the burnout level that we were seeing, and this was even pre-2020, was just extraordinary. And I realized from my own experience that being a leader in a nonprofit organization, frankly, working at any job in a nonprofit organization, depending on the mission and the work that you do, is one of the highest burnout situations that we face. And I think I was seeing it as a crisis facing the sector. And so I decided I wanted to do coaching, and then 2020 hit with a pandemic that none of us were really expecting. And it really gave me an opportunity to build on the coaching part of what I do. So some of what I'm going to do over the course of our 2 sessions together in this course, we'll be talking about some of the key principles and applications of board governance, but there's also the CEO side of that, right? This course is about the board and the executive and what that partnership looks like. What are some of the moral responsibilities we have to our organizations, both from a governance and a leadership standpoint? And how, what do you need to be focused on? Some of you I know, having looked at the roster, are in an executive director or CEO role. Some of you might be aspiring to that type of a role. But what are some of the things that also in that role, we need to make prioritization decisions too, and really be mindful of how we strategically govern and strategically lead to make sure that we are well positioned for what our programs and our services are designed to do. So that's kind of a theme. Personal passion of mine is making sure as leaders that we are able to breathe and put our own oxygen masks on, as well as those for our staff and the clients that we serve. So one of the things we normally do leading into this course is a brief assignment, which Cassandra and I discovered a few days ago was not in Canvas. So instead of springing that on you, it'll be an assignment for leading up to class number 2. But what I normally ask, and I'm going to ask you all to put it in chat. Actually, I have 2 things I'm going to ask of you. The first thing is your name as it appears on the screen. If you would just put the organization you're with, I have the roster, but just to be able to see it, if you don't know how to change your name, it's the 3 little blue dots on the top right of your own personal square. If you would just put the organization that you're with, that will be helpful to me in as we're working together, and also make sure your name appears the way you want it to. Sometimes it'll say like iPad 2 or Woody's iPad or whatever. Woody's my dog. He probably won't make an appearance, but he's over here by my side. The second thing I'd like for you to do is let's just take a moment and put in chat. I'd like to ask each of you to take a moment and reflect. What is from a governance standpoint, what are 1 or 2 challenges that your organization is currently experiencing? or that you anticipate. If you know, if you don't work with the board, that's okay. You can just say, I don't work with the board and I don't know. And two, what are maybe one or two burning questions or things that you'd really like to make sure you get out of this session? Not between today and session number 2, but this module on board governance and the CEO. What are a couple of things that either are burning questions for you, burning challenges for you, or things you just want to learn? So this will be a silent exercise. We'll give it a minute or so, and maybe a minute or two to type your answers. We've got some good comments coming in. Appreciate everybody's thoughts. All right, we've got some really great ideas coming in. I'm going to read some of them just to kind of comment and see what kinds of themes we have. So we have a sophisticated board, but with that, maybe an aging board. So maybe I'm interpreting that to mean maybe opportunity for some generational diversity, maybe some new blood. Like the board to be more invested outside of our board meetings. Yeah. Do they just show up for the meeting, and what do they do? What's their commitment outside of that? Extreme cuts in federal funding. Yeah, funding is always an ongoing challenge. Boundaries between the board of directors and the CEO. What general reporting items are relevant? What is not so relevant? I.e. programmatic details. To make a shift from managing staff to leadership of an organization's vision. Yeah, depending on the life cycle that the board is in, they may have been very hands-on. Building collaborative process to establish an employee code of conduct and benefits. Great topic. We probably won't get to that, but that's a great topic in terms of what what you're looking at in terms of challenges. Not able to meet the pressing need for family emergency shelter. Needs are greater than what we can serve. I realize our exec director has created a rubber stamp board. They only meet once a year. Wow, that's a big one. Dana, we might need to get together for coffee. I see you're in New Mexico. Keeping board properly informed in operations, but also focused on fundraising. Funding that is tied to legislator Medicaid dollars, another one related to federal funding. I would like to better understand the relationship between the board and CEO. Our org has experienced great growth over the last few years. Has our board grown appropriately to match that? Great question. Funding is a big challenge. Don't work with the board. That's totally okay. You're going to learn a lot, so that when you do have that opportunity, you'll learn more. Want to be board to be more engaged. Founder syndrome. Yep. Understanding what should be proper board structure. Would like the board to help more with fundraising. Very new board and new AD as we are moving to have the board assume the role of fundraising. Would like to learn more about the boundaries, reporting, and prioritizing the big tasks ahead. So we got a lot of different things. Everything from, moving from a founder board and organization to a more, that next level of organizational life cycle. Lots of comments about funding, federal funding dependency, the board needing the board to do more fundraising. Some, is the board rubber stamping, or are they really engaged? and what really ultimately is the role of the board versus the CEO, and where do those boundaries live? So lots of really, really good questions, and we're going to get to a lot of that today and in our following subsequent class. So a couple of things about how I run class. I would like for it to be very interactive. You have a lot of reading. This class assumes that you have some fundamentals in Board 101, that you have some understanding of that, which is why we gave you so many sort of background and fundamental readings, because I recognize that everybody comes with different experience levels. That said, I'm happy to dive into questions that come up that may be a little bit more fundamental. There is no stupid question. This is tricky stuff. And the other thing I really want to, just from a ground rule standpoint, really help you, really want to emphasize is that my answers are typically going to be, it depends. Because board governance and how the CEO or the executive, if there is even an executive, sometimes there's not, there's lots of organizations out there that don't have any paid staff. So what that role looks like, what's the right structure, what's the right fundraising mix, what's the right this, that, or the other. It's often, my answer is often going to be, it depends. So a lot of this is about how do we apply the principles within the circumstances that you're facing. The other thing I want to emphasize is that there is this traditional governance model that we teach. And the reality is organizations are changing, they're evolving. We're starting to see co-leadership, co-executives. We've seen, I'm working with an organization right now where the whole C-suite is reporting to the board. So it's more of a shared leadership model where there's, there is a CEO, but it's a shared leadership model. Where, so the traditional hierarchical model may be evolving depending on the type of organization that you are. The other thing we're seeing in terms of the trends is honestly, the search for volunteers. Volunteerism has changed in this country as the workforce has changed, as economic circumstances have changed, as family dynamics have changed. And as a result, people don't have the same kind of time that they used to. However, we have all of these baby boomers that are retiring and, Gen Xers like me thinking about how can I retire early? So there may be opportunity there too. But my point is there is no one right answer. And I really want to emphasize that. There are legal constraints, there are legal requirements that are set by the IRS, that are set by whatever state you're in, your state's corporation commission sets certain, requirements. And then there are your bylaws. Beyond that, there is no one specific way that it has to operate. So those are my kind of ground rules. Based on that, I'm going to go ahead and officially start my slide deck. So let me get that up and running here. Everybody see this? I want to make sure. All right, great. I do have two screens, so if I'm looking over here or over here, I'm sure we've all figured that out by now. It's not because I'm not paying attention to you. All right, okay, so this is our class, and again, thank you to Beach Fleischman for your wonderful sponsorship. It's been a great partnership. Happy to have you here, Eric. So learning goals, this just kind of goes very high level into what we're going to be talking about, roles and responsibilities. We're going to be talking about modes of governance because there are different ways that boards operate. We're going to be talking about how you can support governance as leadership in your organization. And we're also going to be talking about the effectiveness of the executive leader and board relationships. We're going to be talking about a whole lot of other things, but that's just at a very high level to kind of help us understand the direction we're heading. Oops, we're going to start with a brief breakout. I'm going to give you 10 minutes. And in that conversation, and Cassandra, if we could have maybe groups of 3, I'm thinking. If we have a group of 4, that's fine, or even a group of 2, however it pans out. Here's your discussion question. What is governance? What does it look like in practice? And how is it different from management? So take a minute or two, introduce yourselves if you haven't connected previously with whoever you're partnered with, and it's just sort of an open conversation. So 10 minutes, we'll bring you back and we'll do a quick debrief, okay? All right, we're good to go. All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope those were good discussions. Good. I always found the interactions with each other are one of the best parts of these courses. And when I took it, we were live in person. Obviously, with the pandemic, we converted this to a virtual class, which makes it also easier for people in all parts of the state and other states to participate. But you lose that, that in-person dynamic. So I definitely like to enable you to take advantage of this opportunity. Okay, who wants to share? Anyone want to share a comment or two on what you discussed in your breakouts?
Hi, this is Kim. I'll go ahead and jump in. Nellie and I had a fabulous discussion about our existing boards. Both of us tend to have policy governance type boards where, as my board has always explained it, they build a swimming pool and I can do whatever I want in it as long as I stay in the pool. And, but between the two of us, we have very different boards where they're coming from. And, as far as management, they leave the management to the executive director. But they're there to, well, again, keep us compliant, keep us legal, keep me in the pool. But it was amazing how when Nellie and I were chatting, our boards look at that very differently. And it's mostly surrounding about the support the board gives you. You can have a policy governance board that is very supportive and one that's just, well, the whole rubber stamping idea, and even my board will do that at times. And I'd like to see them get them a little bit more engaged, but great discussion. And if somebody has a very, very managing board, do you even need an executive director? It feels like sometimes because they're doing it. Do you want to plant flowers outside your building? Talk to the board. Like, no, if I decide to plant flowers, I'm going to plant flowers. But it was a great discussion Nellie and I had.
Awesome. I love that analogy. I hadn't heard that before about the swimming pool. I'm going to use that. Awesome. All right. Anyone else who else would like to share? Let's get maybe two other share outs. We're not going to have time for everyone, but just to get some samples.
I can jump in. I was sharing, I had both experiences. So I was a board chair for 3 years for one nonprofit, and now I'm being recruited as president of a different nonprofit. And so we were talking about kind of the different perspectives and how to work across CEO and board from the different perspectives.
Anyone want to take a stab at really defining for us governance? What is governance? Did anyone really dive into what that means?
I think we spoke a little bit about that. And for me, my reflection, even here in this group, is just how it aligns with what we do as an organization. So governance for us, and I believe consistently for the group that we met with, is that high level oversight of the direction of the organization, the mission and purpose focus, and keeping everyone in line with respect to that. The governance that I personally experience is such that says we're here for that purpose, but allow you to run the organization and come to us for support and additional direction, or anywhere we can jump in to support the ongoing mission and sustainability of the mission itself. And the practice really for me comes within the management of the organization and offering the best practices to move the mission forward, to sustain the mission, to grow the organization under all of those mission-centered purposes. And the management to me is there's a very defined line in keeping that separate from governance and from the practice of the governance.
Very good. Very good. Yeah, excellent. Anyone else? We'll take one more. Anyone else want to share? Might call on someone if you're not careful. Come on, who hasn't talked in a while? This is an opportunity to practice your voice.
I can share. We talk a
Awesome.
lot with governance, just in terms, same thing. That big picture, the strategy, kind of those guiding principles, but also really accountability. So again, not the day-to-day management, but once you've set those policies, the strategy, things like that, and then holding people accountable to that. So.
Great. Good input. Good thoughts, all of you. All right. So Peter Drucker, you may have heard of him, thought leader in this space. He said, the board not only helps think through the institution's mission, it is the guardian of that mission and make sure the organization lives up to its basic commitment. I love this quote because I love the idea of being a guardian of that. It doesn't mean that you micromanage it, but really at the end of the day, our boards are there as 501c3s, the legal structure that we have, the tax exemption that we get from the IRS really puts us in a place where we have to operate within the public trust. We don't own it. We don't profit from it. I mean, we get paid a salary, maybe, depending on your organization. But the public owns these organizations. And so if you can think of it as a guardian, or if anyone has a better word, feel free to share it. But really there to make sure, I love the concept of being there to make sure we live up to our commitment. So are we operating within the mission? Are we meeting, the requirements, the legal, the compliance, I think was mentioned. But also when we're setting strategy, not just are we doing it now, but where are we headed? And does the mission need to evolve? Are we meeting the needs of our community, our stakeholders, all of those big, hairy questions? So think just in terms of a structure of thinking about this. Hang on, I just have to move too many people up on my screen. I gotta close that a little bit. Okay, sorry. All right. So think of this in terms of 4 mandates. One is to establish that strategic vision, the direction, and the goals of the organization. I'm often asked, who's responsible for setting strategy? Is it the CEO or is it the board? Ultimately, it's the board, but it's a both answer. It's both are involved in the executive plays a key role in that, but the ultimate approval, the ultimate holder of the keys, so to speak, is the board of directors in terms of defining what is the strategic vision, mission, direction. And when we say goals, we mean those high-level strategic goals. Obviously, operating goals become the responsibility of management. Second mandate is capacity. Assuring that the organization has the resources and the capacity to fulfill the mission and strategy that have been established. So the board doesn't get to say, this is going to be our strategy, this is our mission, go do it. Oh, and by the way, there's no money, and no, you can't hire any people. The board has that responsibility to make sure that whatever strategic vision or goals that are set, that the organization actually has the capacity to fulfill that. That's where the fundraising piece comes in. So, a lot of comments in the pre-question around, how do I get my board more involved in fundraising? That is the mandate. It is, if your funding comes from the federal government, okay, well, what's the board's role in helping make sure that we're in a position to secure and keep those contracts or those grants? If it's private fundraising, what's the board's role in that as well? So you don't get to just walk away and say, oh, well. So that's a really important element of the board's mandate. Performance, monitoring and strengthening organizational performance and impact. So how is the organization performing? What key metrics are you using to indicate that the organization is actually successful in delivering on its mission, on its strategy? What's the period of, what are the periods of a review? I think I remember who said the board only met annually. All right, well, how is the board, monitoring? Maybe are other things happening in between that annual meeting to monitor if the organization is on track. And then finally, systems. This is the governance system. So this is making sure that you have effective governance structures and processes. So that's your board meetings, that's your reporting, that's your succession planning. It is, how does the board operate, and how does it operate in partnership with the executive, if there is an executive? At the center, always mission, vision, values. That's the fundamental. That's the core. Everything else stems from that. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or raise your hand at any time. Like I said, I want this to be an interactive, but I'm going to keep rolling through slides unless somebody has a specific question. So a couple of key questions. How do you distinguish governance from management? These are 7 really good questions to ask. It comes from Barry Bader, Distinguishing Governance from Management. But is it big? So we're thinking about acquiring a new building or expanding from Phoenix and adding services in Flagstaff, or so it's the really, really big. Think strategic, think fundamental, major changes. Is it about the future? That's where strategic visioning comes in. So is it about what we want to be doing 3 years down the road? Is it core to the mission? So are you thinking of changing the mission? Are you thinking of adding a service line that might cause us to rethink what the mission is? Is it a high level policy needed? So for example, I think somebody put in there like code of ethics. A code of ethics, that's a really good one, right? Like that's a big policy thing that the board should be involved in and aligned to. Is a red flag flying. So that is, what might be a good red flag? Theft obviously is a red flag. Compliance with IRS would be a red flag. Compliance, if you're out of compliance with a major grant source, that would be a red flag. We have an employee who just filed an EEOC complaint. That would be anything like of a legal nature. Those are big red flags that you want to bring the board in on. We could go list all day long the types of red flags, but you want to know your board has your back when it comes to the things that could be a red flag. So think about the headline test. If this appeared in on the front page of the Arizona Republic or on the Morning Drive News, would that be something you don't want your board to hear about that way? You want to be in conversation with them as soon as those big red flags start flying. Is a watchdog agency involved? So if you get federal funding, that would be the Department of Labor, Department of Economic Security, wherever you're getting your funding from. There's a watchdog element there, but it's also the Better Business Bureau, the state, right? Like, so state and federal government, and other types of watchdogs. So for example, if you're one of the things, I know the watchdog agency is like Charity Navigator, those types of GuideStar, those are what I mean by watchdog agencies. If your program percentage was dropping precipitously low, that's something the board should be talking about, because that's going to be a public knowledge issue at some point. And then the final one is, does the CEO want and need the board's support? So that comes at the end. That is not a leading question. You have to kind of meet all these other criteria, but it's also those situations where, even so, if you think of the board as the boss, so if let's just say you were a program director and you report to the CEO, there are going to be things you're going to go to your CEO on to say, this one's a sticky one and I'm not quite sure. I want to do a gut check with you. Or maybe I have a stakeholder, I've got some stakeholders who've given me some feedback, and I'm not really sure what the best approach is. The board can be utilized as a sounding board for those kinds of things as well. Now, we always have CEOs that don't want the board support, that view the board as a irritating inconvenience that is there to simply, support and make sure that we meet minimum criteria. But if you're really stacking your board with high level professionals, with people who are smart, who care about your mission, who maybe bring a whole plethora of other skills to the table, then you're utilizing them as an extension, as thought partners for some of the things that, you know, as mentors even for things that might come up. So there's lots of other questions to ask, but that's just one framework that might be helpful in determining whether something, you know, is board level or not. So I'm going to take a stop here and see if there's any interest, anyone has any questions that they want to ask related to this before we move on. We good? All right, great. All right, board fiduciary duties. I presume that you know what these are, that you've done your reading, that you've heard of these before. These are the fiduciary duties that are talked about everywhere: the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience. We're going to talk about them today in the context of what does it look like in practice? And as an executive of an organization, what might be your responsibility in helping the board satisfy these responsibilities? So let's start with the duty of loyalty. The duty to act in the interests of the nonprofit organization, those it serves, and those donating funds to support the mission, as opposed to acting in one's self-interest. What might be an example of a situation that might arise that might challenge the duty of loyalty? What might be a red flag that might fly where you might say, this falls under duty of loyalty. Let's take a step back and talk about it.
We had a situation where board members were hearing what foundations were contributing and potentially going after grants for their own organizations with those same funders.
It's a great example. Yeah, I often get the question, well, you know, how do you navigate this is about conflict of interest. Fundamentally, duty of loyalty is about conflict of interest. It's just to simplify it. So how do you navigate when you have other nonprofit leaders serving on your board, which is very common in community-based organizations? How do you make sure that you can keep those straight? And it's a tough one. And, you know, honestly, that's publicly available information too. So that might be a tricky one. Other examples of conflict of interest or duty of loyalty challenges might be, I'll give you an example. So I've worked with organizations that have gone through fraud situations. It was mentioned in my bio that I've done a lot of turnaround work, often coming in after some sort of a really crisis situation like a fraud. So I was involved in one, and the board of directors was populated with really high level people from big companies in that particular market. It was not an Arizona situation. And board members started to get really concerned that they started to say, you know, I think I have a conflict here, because my duty, you know, I have to be thinking about my company's obligations, my company's reputation, and I can't drag them down with this. So that's sort of the opposite way of looking at it, in the sense that sometimes their obligation to other parties might prevent them to really being loyal to your organization. So that was a choice they had to make. Vendor bidding. If you have, let's just say you're working on some renovations for your facility, and you have a contractor on your board, and your contractor says, "Oh, I'll do it at cost. I got it. Here's what it'll cost." Or maybe you just say, "Hey, John, you own a construction company. Can you do this for us?" Well, if he's donating, that's one thing. But if, you know, how do you know it's at cost? And how do you know that that's the best vendor to use? You know, what's the, you know, if John gets to put his big banner outside that says construction by John and his people, he's getting something from that. So this is where bidding comes in, right? Like that, you know, we bid jobs out to make sure that we're doing the best for the organization. It would be a conflict of interest for John to get that business without us having gone through a good competitive bidding process. And even if you decide John is the best vendor for this project, that is still a conflict of interest that has to be disclosed. John can't sit in on the committee when the bidding is taking place. He can't review the bids of any of the other companies. He can't be part of the conversations because he would have violated that conflict of interest. So duty of loyalty. Yep, go ahead.
I was going to say one thing that we've done. I work for a community college. One thing we've done to kind of mitigate these conflicts of interest and we're talking about right now, is basically educating our board so they have a full understanding of what they can do and what they can't do. Because that way, if they venture into something, basically being educated on what they're doing and they commit an offense, then basically the onus is on them. So education
Absolutely.
is a big key with us on our board, just making sure you understand what's involved with this board position, what you can do and what you can't.
And you have a duty to report. You have a duty to disclose also when you have a conflict of interest. And the board gets to decide, I mean, you can recuse yourself, but the board can also ask you to step aside for those conversations or any of those things. I highly recommend, strongly urge you all to have a conflict of interest agreement with your board, that be part of your board documents. I've worked for organizations that mandate that gets signed annually, just as a constant reminder. Good point. Training. All right. Duty of care. Duty of care is the duty to exercise reasonable care and judgment in the process of making informed decisions consistent with what you believe to be in the best interest of the organization. Anyone want to take a stab at that one? What that might look like in practice? Or a situation you've encountered? This is a tough one for a lot of people. So this is essentially the, this is essentially the reasonable man, and I put that in quotes, not to be gender, biased here. It's what is reasonable and prudent. So as long as the board, so one lens to look through all of this is where could the board and where could the organization get into hot water? It's one way to look at this. And one way for the board to get in hot water is if they are making decisions that the general human being out there would look at and think, yeah, that's reasonable based on the information that they had. So reasonable decision based on the information, based on, the mission, based on, whatever other facts are there. It's not reckless. So you're not, for example, putting your investments into high risk investment vehicles, for example. You're doing something that's more reasonable, that, there's some degree of risk, but it's not, it's not highly volatile stocks that, or whatever other forms of investment that might be very risky. That would just be one example. Where this comes into play is when the crap hits the fan, and something goes to any kind of a legal issue. That's going to be the judgment question of, was it a reasonable decision? The other piece of this is the board has to have reasonable information. So that's where a big part of where the executive comes in. Is the board receiving adequate information to make its decisions, to do its job? If the executive team, if the staff held information back, then the board can't reasonably be expected to execute in a prudent way. Good comment from Flynn. We believe the duty of the executive team is to provide the details, offer a full understanding of the discussion. The duty of the board is to review, understand, and vet. Yes, absolutely. So that's a really good point, because part of this is also reviewing materials. I've worked with boards where it's like, do they even read any of the information we send them? right? Part of the duty of care is the responsibility to familiarize yourself with the information that's being provided by the organization in order to effectively make decisions. Part of the executive's responsibility is to present that information in ways that are relevant, digestible, factual, and frankly succinct. If you're giving your board, 3 volumes of material to review in advance of a board meeting, you're not boiling it down to the most strategic things that the board needs to be able to consider. You can't expect them to know, every detail of your budget, but you can expect them to have an understanding of, high level, what are major investments that we're making, what are big variances from prior year, where are the risks in the budget, all of those kinds of things. Okay, and then the final one, duty of obedience. I hate the word obedience for this. Some other different states use different language for this, but this is the duty to operate in compliance with the organization's mission, bylaws, policies, and applicable laws and regulations. So if the board makes a decision to start up a healthcare clinic, but the organization's mission is to educate K through 12, that would be like complete violation of the duty of obedience. Like, where the heck did that come from? Now, if you want to change the organization's mission, great, do that first. Bylaws, how outdated are the bylaws? Part of this is reviewing the bylaws on a regular basis, making sure that those are in place, making sure you have good policies in place, and then understanding applicable laws and regulations. This comes into play a lot with HR issues. It comes into play a lot with, I'm trying to think of some other ways that this comes into play. Just making sure you're filing your IRS 990, for example. I have a situation, I'll be really candid. I'm about to become president of a board. It's an entirely volunteer board. Our official name, according to the IRS, does not match our name according to the state of New Mexico, and does not match the name that's on our bylaws. We got a little problem we got to fix. So those are just some of the examples of things that boards, kind of need to pay a little bit of attention to from time to time. Anyone else want to give an example of duty of obedience that they maybe have encountered? What do you think the executive's role? So we've gone over these 3 very fundamental concepts. Where do you think the executive's role is in this? Maybe somebody who hasn't talked yet.
I think that it's definitely the executive's responsibility to guide and work with the board on these things.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just appreciative of everything you're saying. I worked with an organization as the executive director a few years ago where the conflict of interest and everything, the bylaws, the policies, like this person was married to this person. It was just such a mess. It was such a mess. But yeah, so I definitely feel like it's the executive director's responsibility.
Yeah, to guide the board on these things.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Maybe to help draft material.
Yeah.
Okay, we need a policy on such and such, let's, maybe the staff are doing the work to draft those policies.
Mm-hmm.
Who's the secretary of the board? Sometimes you have a staff member who supports that process.
Mm-hmm.
When I was with the Make-A-Wish Foundation, our secretary was actually we had a position who served as the board secretary. It was the only, alongside the CEOs, really the only, and she wasn't a voting member, but she managed all of the materials to make sure that things were in order. We see some of this falling apart a lot when you have the startup board. To your point, everybody knows each other. They're all friends, maybe related. The founder is really driving the organization. I'll give you a situation I was consulting with, actually it's a friend. He and his wife started a new nonprofit. I was coaching them on it, and they were trying to figure out how to be able to deduct or get credit for, they were working out of their home. They were offering programming. They had a back garage that had been converted into an office. So they were using that facility. And it was, how much of our expenses can we legitimately write off? And I was like, not the landscaping, like you're going too far. It's legitimate, for some of it. And if you have actually, documented that, certain expenses have increased as a result of running this out of your home, but you have to be super, super, super careful to document absolutely everything to make sure that you're not, this is really about protecting ourselves, protecting our board members, to not put ourselves in a position where we can be accused of doing something that is inappropriate. All right. Let's go on. We're going to take a break in about, maybe about 5 minutes or so. Let me finish this unit and then we'll take a brief break. So why fiduciary responsibilities matter? So I like this visual because it's sort of that concentric circle concept that, we have some really fundamental basic legal standards. That's like the do not pass go kind of stuff. You have to be considering the best interests of the organization. You have to be thinking about public perception, which is even bigger. So, right, like, you could sit there and say, well, it's legal. Okay, but just because it's legal doesn't mean you should do it. Because you have to be thinking of what's the public perception? What will our donors think? What would our clients think? What would my next door neighbor think about this if I'm suddenly in the news over this? And then the broader question of ethics. We need to be principled in the work that we do, whether or not it's legal. So if you're looking at a situation, you're going, well, but it's legal, we can do it, doesn't mean you should. We're going to talk more about that in our second session. We actually have a really great framework that ASU has developed that we're going to test out. This will be the first class we're going to use it with to test out this new framework of principled decision making. So the bottom line here is you have to constantly be thinking about the bigger picture of what is ethical. What is ethical for the people you serve, for your stakeholders, for your employees, for your board members, for your volunteers, even if it's legal. So that is really, and helping your board members understand that, because everybody's vision of what is ethics, sometimes depends on your point of view, your upbringing, your culture. What might be appropriate to one person might be completely out of the norm for somebody else. So we always have to take a higher standard. All right, let's go ahead and take a break now. It's going to be a quick bio break. I'm going to give you, it's 2 after according to my clock. Let's be back at 10 after. So 7 minutes or so. Okay. Oh, just hit 10:10, so. All right, so for the next segment, we're going to talk about governance as leadership, which is a concept that was put forth, I think it was about 2005, introducing 3 modes of governance that together create a governance as leadership model. So we're going to go through that. Some of you may be familiar with this, but this is a concept that we're going to be using for a case study today. So you're going to pay some special attention to understanding kind of what these different elements are. So it's a triangle, and the idea of this is that there are 3 types of leadership that boards can exhibit. The first is fiduciary. Those are, we just talked about fiduciary duty. So it's the fundamental governance oversight, the compliance, all of those things. Strategic, which is directional, where are we headed? What's our plan? And generative is probably one of the hardest concepts for a lot of students to capture, gets into the bigger questions around meaning, around mission, around, what does it really mean to, I'll give you an example. When I worked for Make-A-Wish, I remember, there were conversations about what's a wish. That may seem like something really obvious and fundamental, but we needed to define that. And so those were some really good generative conversations. Eligibility was another one we talked a lot about. So fiduciary, back to those legal responsibilities. So the oversight and stewardship, it's really about what's wrong. it is anything wrong? It is, what are the red flags? So as I step into this role as president, I'm seeing red flags all over the place. We're going to be spending a lot of time in fiduciary mode, just getting some of the basics, right? What's the name of our organization, and have we filed a 990, and what's, where's the bank account and who's got access to it? Passwords, compliance. Eric from Beach Fleischman mentioned was it privacy? I think the service, there was a great service that's being offered. Putting those type like cybersecurity, what is in place for our organization to protect us? Do we have those systems in place? This is a great way to use some of your board members who also come from a corporate background, because as nonprofits, we often don't have the resources. Not always. We've got some pretty well-funded nonprofits, but oftentimes we don't have the resources to take care of some of the fundamental business that just are, no-brainers in the corporate arena. So I've walked into a lot of organizations where the technology support and services were really outdated. So, cybersecurity issues, data protection, password policies, that kind of stuff. Now, I'm not saying the board should get into the nitty-gritty of it, but those are the types of questions. How are we protecting the organization? How are we following appropriate employment law? If we're going to be terminating somebody at a high level, are we following appropriate procedures? Those kinds of things. So it asks the question, what's wrong, or what could go wrong? That's another good way of asking it. Strategic looks at the major decisions about where we're going and how we're going to get there. So these are the major decisions about programming, resource, budget, services. Ask the question, what's the plan? How are we going to solve? So if the problem that if our organization, I'm looking at what some of your organizations, so Arizona Humane Society, I'm going to pick on you for a minute, Matt, because I know your organization. The problem that your organization is seeking to solve, define that for me, just real quick.
We're trying to solve, I guess if you call it animal homelessness.
Okay. Animal homelessness, humane treatment of animals, animal welfare, right? Those kinds of things. So the board would be looking at what's our strategy. There's probably a lot of different ways. Any organization, when you think about your mission, there's probably multiple avenues that you could tackle to fulfill your mission. The mission statement doesn't necessarily tell us exactly how we're going to do that. There are choices to be made, choices in how we allocate resources. Somebody said a couple of people said they were having substantial loss in federal contracts or federal grant funding. So if you're losing funding, what's our plan? If new funding becomes available, are we going to pursue it? Are we going, which way are we going to go? That's when the board is in strategic mode. So what's wrong? What's the plan? And generative is when we're doing that deeper inquiry work. Most boards do not spend much time in deeper inquiry work. It's really when we're looking at the root causes, the values. What are all of the, are we on the right track, or should we be considering taking a different approach to what we're doing? So for example, it might be, how do we help influence legislation around animal welfare? I don't know. I'm just trying to, kind of put it into some real life terms. How might we get, so I think we have somebody from Child Crisis Arizona. Yes, Caitlin, right? So, you're dealing with the crisis, right? These are kids who are in crisis. What's the pre-work? How might we get more into a preventative mode? What is the root cause of the issue? We're here a lot of our organizations are focused on solving versus really trying to understand root cause. What might be some other generative? So anyone want to take a stab at what for your organization might be a deeper generative conversation that might be worth having, or that maybe you have had? or want to have?
I mean, we've tried to define, because we typically only deal with companion animals, which are dogs and cats. But we've tried to define like what is a companion animal, because there's lots of different types of animals that are kept as pets nowadays. So, and how prepared are we to take care of those versus dogs and cats?
Yeah, goats, peacocks, right?
Maybe even donkeys.
Maybe even oh, it was a donkey. Sorry, donkey. Yeah. Well, where I live in New Mexico, you know, if you just drive a few miles up the road, we got llamas, cows, horses, peacocks, you name it. Probably some donkeys. Just down the street, there are some of those miniature horses. What do they call those? The little ones. Anyway. So yeah, right. Like, do we need to expand? How are we going to address that? Emerging challenges. What is our fundamental responsibility? Employee, I don't know. There's all kinds of things that any one of your organizations might want to talk about. Anyone else want to share an idea? Or maybe we could even explore what it might look like for your organization.
I have something.
Great.
So I work at Crossroads, that we're substance abuse treatment. Like the question I feel like that comes to mind is, how do we prevent relapse, like clients relapsing? And it kind of leads into like creating new ideas, which we've really expanded on our outpatient services and aftercare programming. And that's kind of really helped a lot. Preventative services, things like that.
Yeah, great example. Yeah. How do we prevent recurrence? When I worked for a mentoring organization, is mentoring enough, and what other tools are needed to support our mentors in this process? What other programming? How do we prevent kids dropping out of school? All of those kinds of things were conversations. Anyone else want to share? Caitlin, you're on mute.
Oh, thank you. So for us, the question was about how do we expand the services? So we, started with a very smaller age group known for the younger youth, but how do we grow the services as the kids get older? So like adding group homes for older kids, extended foster care. So again, not just focusing on one age group, but making sure that those young kids have the support all the way up until adulthood.
Yeah. Thinking bigger, like, where do we want to be? So strategic is often like, you're looking at like maybe a 2 to 5 year plan of where we headed. But, these would be the bigger mission oriented questions. Might be stakeholder, really getting a better sense of, are we meeting the needs of our stakeholders? It might be, if we're losing massive funding, where are we headed? In a bigger picture, do we need to rethink our funding sources? Those are some of the bigger kind of challenging types of topics. Yeah. Great. You guys got this.
I'll jump in real quick. I just want to jump in real quick because I think what we kind of did was we ended up starting another organization because of those kinds of discussions. So I am the director of IBE, the STO, which is a tax credit organization. For 25 years, it's been around helping kids get to private school education, particularly low income and children with special needs. This was fine and great and wonderful, but this was not necessarily taking care of the low income families where they were, what they really needed. Tuition wasn't enough. I couldn't help kids in public schools. I couldn't help kids in charter schools. I couldn't help kids in preschools. And so we launched the IBE Foundation just recently so that we could do more, because again, tuition, private school, great. I mean, trust me, we're doing great work there. It wasn't enough, and there was more need there. So we launched a new foundation just to take care of those only low-income families, whatever schooling they're at here in Arizona.
It's a great example. Is there another organization that might be, merger? That would be another. Like, are we better served? I was coaching an executive who was hired on an interim basis for a global organization, And when she came in, it was they'd gone through a crisis in the transition from founder to a more established organization. There were some issues with the founders. The founders were asked to leave. And so she was brought in to kind of look at where are we going as an organization. And in conversation with the board, they ultimately made the decision to explore merger. And that was a bit, and they did ultimately. So they were able to find a similar organization that was doing similar work, that was excited about the opportunity that this would create. Collaboration, are there other organizations out there that we can collaborate with? Is there any other organization that is serving a similar need? Those are big questions to be asking, especially as funding sources are tenuous a lot of the time. Great. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick recap, just different ways of looking at this. So we've got a couple of slides that are going to kind of just give you a different framing of this same concept. So again, thinking about fiduciary governance as preventing theft or waste, misuse of resources. Are we deploying resources appropriately? Are we safeguarding the mission and maintaining the primacy of organizational interests? So it's really that, what we traditionally think of as governance and this is where, when hits the fan, the public, the oversight agencies, the newspaper is going to ask, where was the board? Because ultimately, even if the board was not knowledgeable that something was going on, there's always going to be an expectation that the board's in charge. Where was the board? So that's like the most baseline. You gotta get this stuff done. Second level is strategic, where we're looking at how do we increase our impact. A SWOT analysis sometimes, or a PESTLE analysis, a SOAR analysis, if you've heard of those. Like, how do we really understand the strategic impact of our organization, what we're doing well, where we can improve, aligning the vision for where we're headed. A lot of strategic governance is about alignment of goals, strategy. Should we expand to the West Valley? Should we add a new service unit? If in the near term, those are sort of alignment discussions to be had. Fostering strategic thinking, and then basically the strategic partnership with management. These conversations are joint conversations. Strategy very rarely is going to ever happen without the management, at least the CEO, if not the entire team or management team, being part of those conversations. And then for generative, it's insight and understanding, identity questions. How do we bring wisdom and thoughtful leadership to this organization? Another example of generative governance. You'll find I draw a lot on my own private personal experiences, but when I worked for Make-A-Wish, we had the national board had really high level CEOs. I mean, and leaders. We had people from Southwest Airlines, Disney, Hilton, all of these big companies, and we would always dedicate. The board met quarterly, the full board, and we would dedicate time to asking the board, what is happening in your industry that might be helpful for us to know here at Make-A-Wish. And so we got guidance on technology issues and where they were seeing disruption in industry, some of the trends that they were dealing with, people issues, because a lot of those bigger corporations have the resources and they're more on the front lines of some of those issues than maybe our nonprofits might be. So another great way to bring the thought partnership of your board to the table of, what else are we not thinking about that as an organization that you're seeing that might be helpful for us to be considering? So this is this graph kind of shows also how to look at it over time. So if you think about the opportunity for generative work, it's about making sense of things. It's framing. It's really big picture. What is our mission anyway? What are we here to do? Why should we? Then, strategic is where we do the thinking and the planning, actually taking that framing and putting it into a strategy, setting direction. What do we want to do about that? And then the fiduciary is really the inquiry, the oversight elements. And over time, if you think about it, if you think about it almost like this isn't the graph, but if you think about it as a circle or as a process chart, you may come back to the beginning to kind of ask what are we here to do? Are we still relevant? Okay, how does that inform our strategy? And then how do we then oversee and make sure that we're executing in the way that we said we would? So this is, some people really like this graph, some people find it hard to grasp, but whichever of these models works best for you to understand is really the whole point. And then the board operates across all three. This graph or table helps you kind of see what the purpose is. So generative is a source of leadership, strategic partnership, and then fiduciary is stewardship. Making sense, being a strategist, being a steward. What's the core work? Finding and framing, scanning the environment, setting, and overseeing the operation. So this is just yet another, that's why I kind of tried to frame this to say, I'm going to show you several slides to help you see where this might happen. With the conducive process, this is something to think about. Like, where do these conversations take place? Generative probably is the whole board. It's inclusive. Lots of, you might even involve stakeholders, community in some of those conversations. Strategic work often happens in task forces or in ad hoc work groups, but also certainly with the full board. Fiduciary often starts with standing committees, right? So you have a finance committee, audit committee. I know in California, those have to be separate committees. In Arizona and in other states, it's often combined. You might have an HR committee. You might have a program committee, a fundraising committee. A lot of those standing committees are doing some of that day-to-day fiduciary work, but you got to bring it back to the full board as well. So it's just another way to look at where do these conversations take place. Inclusive, the generative and strategic conversations, a lot of times they also take place at retreats. Let's get away for a day and really do some in-depth work together. All right. We are running ahead of time. Actually, we're making really good time. So let's just take a moment before we jump into the case study and just talk. What's coming up for all of you? What questions do you have? Maybe a real life situation. Let's just take a few minutes and just chat. And I'm really good with silence, so I'm just going to sit here until somebody wants to talk.
What do you mean when you say what's coming up for us? Like projects?
Questions? What thoughts, as I presented that, what thoughts, ideas? When I say what's coming up for you, meaning like, what are the thoughts that you're having about all of this? Is it like, yeah, I get it, Deb, this makes sense? Or are you like, wow, my board's not doing any of this?
Everything makes sense. One thought that I had was that I wish there was like a universal board training, something that you had to like go through to be on the board of a nonprofit, because as all of you probably know, there's some wild decisions being made by nonprofit boards.
There are, yeah. And we could talk about them all day long. And I have seen a lot of it because I like being in the turnaround mode. I've had to step in. So when I worked for Make-A-Wish, I oversaw all of our chapters across the U.S. And so when a chapter was misbehaving, I and my team were the people who flew in and kind of said, yo, this is not kosher and we need to kind of take a step back and look at it. And I've done everything from firing board members, which gets a little tricky when you don't have the authority, but I found ways to do it. And most of you don't have a national or international oversight agency like a federated nonprofit might. But I've also seen it with funders. I'm working with an organization right now that has significant grant funding from a federal agency, and the federal agency came in and did a compliance audit. And there's a lot of concerns and governance related concerns. And And so, you know, if you are independent, completely independent, you know, where does the authority for that lie? And so, but to your point, there are trainings out there. A lot of organizations offer training. There are online, you know, there's some free ones, there's some low cost ones. I would encourage you to make sure if you're in a position to do so with your organization, to make sure that you've got really solid onboarding and training. With the nonprofit that I'm about to become president of, it's a global professional association. It's a 501c6, not a 501c3, but we're subject to, you know, similar, you know, regulations. And our national or global organization provides a webinar series that every board member is required to take. Now they give you a year to complete it, which I think is ridiculous. I think it should be completed before, you know, within like your first month on the board, or even before you join the board. But there are some free ones out there that I've provided to those links to some of my clients to say, you know, this is a really good basic primer, 90 minutes of their time to get a really good understanding. There's also books out there. It might not be bad to make an investment in, you know, a basic handbook for nonprofit service that, you know, as a gift to incoming board members and asking them to read. But otherwise, it's up to you. Now, in theory, a board is self-governing in that they are taking care of those things themselves. So if you have a really strong board and an active governance committee or board development committee, that different organizations use different terms, part of that is making sure the board is educated. ASU offers a training program. You know, you can talk to Cassandra about that if you want. ASU offers a training program where, you know, you can have one of their trainers come in and do a training for your board. So there are resources out there. They generally follow the same similar concepts. It's fiduciary duties, it's obligations, it's the board CEO relationship, et cetera, et cetera. But they do exist. Others.
I think for me, as you're going through different elements, so I'm in a transition phase. So our organization is a long-standing organization. And we've had some board members on there for, several years, a good amount of time. But I'm transitioning in, adjusting to the format of the relationship that I'm going to have with the board, while also learning about how the previous leader, maintain that. But I have this sense that as you're going through these, you know, different elements of like the structure and governance and such, even to like the generative questions, I have the sense that we almost should get like a fresh start, because I don't feel, from what I've gathered, I think I've had maybe 4 board meetings since I've started, which is just in the summer. But I have this sense that there's not a lot of awareness into the specific programs, or that, so I was one of the ones who initially talked about the boundary, and kind of managing that. But I have this sense that that was so strong and structured that there was not so much participatory decision making, even on those higher level thoughts or the vision or the direction, active participation in fundraising. Like, how do they get to, you know, like when I was in a breakout with Lance, you know, brought up that AAA board member, you know, I don't know that there's been so much built to even get them to a place of being an ambassador, or to have them actively working in fundraising. So in a sense, I kind of feel like we're at a good place to loosely start over, right? We have our established bylaws and policies and conflict of interest form and such. But I think we're at like a rephasing, if that makes sense. And I'm kind of learning how to navigate that. So for me, a lot's coming up in terms of, you're going over this concept and I'm thinking, okay, yeah, no, this would be really good for us to do, you know, collectively. I think that maybe they would do a strategic plan maybe every several years or so, but that may have been the extent of their leading and moving the organization with the CEO. I think maybe it was just more like there wasn't so much, I think maybe like a future forward perspective. So we're kind of navigating those waters now. We have a few new board members, a former VP who was on for a long time, she's recently resigned. She's going on, to different boards. So just a bunch of shifts right now for us in general.
Yeah. Sometimes we have to do a refresh. Sometimes it's good to take a step back and if there's a new leader, new board members, what are the things that might need to be revisited? Yeah, absolutely. Makes sense to me. What do you think that reset might look like? Like where do you think you would start?
That's what I was actually just going to ask you. If I was looking at something like that, where would be, I guess my initial thought, it could just be the way that my mind works. I kind of feel like I have to have like an orderly way of doing things. So in my mind, it's like looking at the education piece for both of us to understand, what is the role of the board to the CEO, which this class is very relevant to me right now. I've had exposure and participation to an extent with boards in the past, but never been that direct person. Maybe I happened to be, participating in this one because I had something relevant programmatically, or they just invited me or something like that. This is my first time actually being in that close responsibility in that role with the board. Yeah. But my thought was maybe kind of revisiting and establishing those roles, and then we can work together on which area we want to tackle first. Because I think like an education or 101 would be relevant.
Yeah, you got to walk before you can run, right? Like these are kind of advanced concepts here, right? Like a lot of boards are still dealing with the fundamentals, and we are gonna get into some more around that. Around like what are some, what does that relationship look like? What is, structural, considerations, those kinds of things. But yeah, you got to start with the basics and making sure that there's a common understanding of what their role actually is, and also, empowering them to execute on that role. Great.
Thank you.
All right. If you can hear, my husband is emptying the dishwasher, so I hope that that's not, if you're hearing banging, that's the plates going into the cupboard. Oh, the joys of working from home, right? Peacocks, dishes, dog, he might squeak his ball at some point too. Anyone else? Yeah. What other things are coming up in your minds as you're thinking about how you might apply this, or kind of how it might impact in your organization?
I'm thinking. Sorry, go ahead. I'm thinking about recruitment of members and where do you get them from? Yeah.
Recruitment of board members.
Are there laws to, just simple questions, are there laws or regulations on how you maybe recruit them or advertise, or
there really aren't.
How do you get a CEO? How much influence does the CEO have in the composition of the board?
Yeah, it's a great question. I believe it's a partnership. We've got some of that content is for session 2, but I think that it's a partnership. The CEO is out in the community representing the organization, fundraising, talking with stakeholders and partners. But both leads can come from both. So, depending on the organization. So I work for an arts organization, big arts organization in Phoenix, and as a fundraiser. And so I was meeting with donors, I was meeting with members, and so yeah, I would sometimes identify somebody like, and I was like, this might be a really good board member. And so I would introduce them to the CEO. I wasn't responsible for board recruitment, but it's a whole process. So I would have everybody in your organization who is intersecting with the community aware of what you're looking for and what your needs are. And helping to prospect, not just for donors, but also for board members. And But you also have to know what you want and what you're looking for. So what are the qualifications that you need in your organization? What are the circles of influence that, both, your different key stakeholders or employees or volunteers might have to help you with that? With the organization that, but your original question, there are no laws or regulations about, I mean, you can advertise, lots of organizations will use LinkedIn. There are companies out there. I worked for an organization that actually paid a recruitment firm. This was at a very high level, to help us identify prospective board members. And we paid per placement, just like you would if you hired a executive search firm to help you hire a CEO. Now, we had a very significant minimum give. And so it made it worthwhile for us because we knew that investment would come back tenfold. But it's an expense. And we, so I'm not advising that for most organizations, but some do it. Word of mouth. There are, and LinkedIn. I mean, I see it all the time on LinkedIn. Volunteer Match is another one I often will see. You can register with Volunteer Match and recruit for board members there. I can't remember. There's some of the other types of places that might be a possibility. Any other thoughts, questions that anyone wants to share? So we're kind of in open discussion right now. We're going to get to the case study, but this is good to bring out some topics.
I think for me, because I've worked in a couple of different organizations, and so just kind of things that I knew like maybe weren't great in one versus something that's done really well in another. And this kind of even brings that even more to the front, like, oh yeah, this is how it should be done, and that probably wasn't. And, just being able to really clearly see some of those differences and the impact that it has.
Yeah, for sure. And you have to also remember, you have to take it a step at a time. Like I said, you got to walk before you can run. If you're in a situation where the board needs a lot of work, you can't tackle it all at once. You got to take it a little bit at a time. Here's another thought. So I'll just share my own experience back to, is it Karam? How do you pronounce your name? Sorry.
Karam.
To your point about how do you recruit board members, so this organization, this professional association that I'm about to become president of, back in, I want to say July, I was brand new to the board when I moved from Phoenix to Albuquerque last year and joined the New Mexico chapter. I had been with the Arizona chapter, and I raised my hand and said, sure, I'll be president next year because nobody else was willing to do it. And about in July, I realized that all but 2 people on the board were about to roll off. So I was like, oh my goodness, I'm about to be, and then we have no staff. We have a virtual assistant, but we have no permanent staff. So I was sitting there going, oh man, I'm going to be sitting here come January 1 with myself, the outgoing president who will serve 1 more year, and 1 other board member. And I'm like, we're an all volunteer organization. And I started panic. And I thought, how am I going to recruit a board? We don't have a process in place. We don't have a succession plan. What am I going to do? I started reaching out. I started calling members. We're a membership organization. So I just sat down and I started emailing members and I said, hi, I'm the incoming president. I'd love to get to know you. And I sat and I did call after call after call, and I gave them my Zoom link and my Calendly link, and I said, would love to talk with you if you're open to it. Here's my link, let's schedule. And I had a lot of people take me up on it. And I was surprised how many people, everybody kept telling me, oh, nobody wants to serve on the board. We found 9 people willing to serve on the board. So sometimes you just have to, get out there in your community. And if you're the executive director and you are spending all of your time behind your desk, and you're not out in your community talking with your donors, talking with constituents, talking with stakeholders, you're never going to find board members. You got to get out there and you got to get to know your community and your stakeholders. So that's my best advice on making it work. Nellie, I saw your hand was up. I don't know if it's still up.
Yeah, it's still up. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay, let me try. Oh, you can see me as well. Good.
Yeah.
So, I feel maybe it's the way I'm receiving the message. I could have sworn that I heard you say that the boards are self-governing. And then CEOs or chief of executive directors has to go out and talk to the community, stakeholders, etc. But then I also heard that, I hear a lot of we have to work with the board. If you come in and the board is at infancy, we have to work with them. So what is a CEO's job? Is it truly that the boards are self-governing and we just offer gentle guidance to whatever it's needed at the time? And I say we, I mean a chief executive officer or an executive officer. I'm an incoming executive officer, so I'm not. I haven't been in several organizations to know exactly, or to be the cheerleader. And I know exactly where you're at, board. I'm gonna take you there. I'm gonna give you training. I'm gonna pay for it. I don't know any of that.
Yeah.
But I guess my original question is, as an incoming executive officer, is it, which one is it? Am I out there going to the community and trying to bring in donors and fundraising and operating the day-to-day operations of the organization? Or am I working with my board and saying, board, get training, board, only focus on this and that, board, recruit other people? What am I doing?
Yeah, welcome to the multiple hats that a CEO wears, truly. So all of it, Nellie, honestly, it is, so it's a partnership. Part of it is working with the board, making sure that the board has what it needs to be able to be successful. Helping identify board members, and the care and feeding of the board. While the board is self-governing, what I mean by that is they're independent in the sense that they hire and fire the CEO. They ultimately make the decisions. So you can bring, for example, recommendations to the board, but they get to make the certain decisions at their level. You may not always agree with those. And so that's really my point, is that it's, an independent self-governing board is what I mean by that is they sit at the top of the organization and have that overall responsibility, and the CEO is reporting to them. Some organizations have the CEO as a voting member. I don't believe in that personally. I think that the executive serves in an advisory role to the board. You attend board meetings, but the board can meet independently without the CEO present. I think that's important too. I believe in boards going into executive session on a regular basis. But yeah, you're going to be wearing a lot of hats. You also have responsibility for the staff. You have responsibility for the mission delivery. You have responsibility for fundraising. So it is a tough job. That's why I said at the beginning, I don't know, when in the very beginning of this call, I actually really believe that being a nonprofit CEO is one of the hardest jobs out there. And I have seen a lot of people go from corporate to nonprofit thinking this was going to be a nice, cushy little job that they could do in their retirement. And they went, holy moly, this is crazy.
Okay.
Because you just don't have the same level of resources. So,
okay.
I'm sorry it's not clear.
I get it. I get it. Thank you for clarifying that.
Juggle.
Good.
Yeah, learn to juggle.
Okay.
Brett. Is it Brett? Bretty? Brett, how do you pronounce your name?
It's Brett. Just ignore the extra letters.
Got it.
I wanted to ask about board retention in a crisis. So I was board chair during a crisis, and at one point during that crisis, I had every single other board member tender their resignation. And I talked them into staying on through the crisis and kind of a crisis remediation plan. And now they are naturally rolling them off now that the organization is stabilized. But what are, at that point I was board chair rather than ED, but what are the recommended strategies for board retention through a kind of life or death crisis for an organization?
It's one-on-one conversations. Honestly, emphasizing the importance of their leadership. And even at that, so before the crisis hits, I think part of board recruitment and understanding your roles and responsibilities, boards are going to experience crisis. There's going to be, you could have an accident on your site where somebody is injured or dies. Client, you could have a situation if you're working with children where there's a violation of some sort of, the sexual abuse or other types of violation. You could have, when I worked for Make-A-Wish, we had all the craziest stuff happen with families traveling. We had a dad show up at TSA. They were headed to Florida to go to Give Kids the World, and we had a dad show up at TSA he had a gun, he had drugs, and he had an excessive amount of cash. But you could have fraud, you could have a leader die, you could have other types of scandals. I mean, we could go on all day talking about the types of crap that goes on in the world. And so this is when we really need steady leadership at the board level. And when I've been in those situations, I've made phone calls. So when I've had to call a board member and say, this is what's happening, I really need your help. And you're gonna have some people who step down, and that's really unfortunate. But this is when we really need the board. So I don't know that there's a magic wand for that particular type of situation. A lot may depend on, why they're on the board in the first place. If the scandal involves a board member, then they need to be removed, even if it's temporary. Situations where maybe a board member is under investigation in their private life or in their professional life that could taint the nonprofit's reputation, take action, have them step down, remove them while pending. Because you can't afford to have that brand. Your brand is everything, right? Your organization, if your brand is reputation is destroyed because of something, you're going to be in a world of hurt. So every situation is going to be different, but it's really important that they understand the role that they play and why their involvement through that crisis is so important. If it's important.
Brett,
I'm sorry, Flynn, you're breaking up there. Can you repeat that?
I was just curious to Brett, what crisis are you talking? COVID? Is it specific to kind of non-performance or a situation like Deborah's described, or do you mean crisis in a different way?
Severe executive director misconduct that included everything from sexual harassment to fraud on government grants to hostile work environment.
Okay, really, really bad stuff, right?
Yeah.
In that situation, I would evaluate if, especially depending on the board members and how they were recruited and what the relationship was with the CEO. As board chair, I might ask some I might suggest that, if they cannot put their that duty of loyalty to the organization first, they don't belong. So retention can be a double-edged sword. There may be people that need to step down as part of something like that, especially if they were in any way aware, or if the relationship with the former CEO, I'm assuming at this point, is such that they cannot really put the organization first. So, all right, we're gonna move on. Yeah,
I was just curious.
Yeah. Let's move on. We have a case study that is going to be put in. Cassandra, will you go ahead and put that, or have somebody put that into the chat? It's a 2-page document. You will have 40 minutes for the case study. So this case study is about an organization, fictional organization, that has all kinds of dysfunctional situations going on. So your responsibility, I think, let's put people into groups of maybe 4 might be a good number. So your responsibility, so here's the situation. You're a consulting firm. So your consultants hired by this organization to help them through the situation that's described in this document. So everyone take a moment, grab the link, go ahead and pull that up, print it out if you can, whatever you need to do to have access to that. And when you get into your groups, you're going to have a total of 40 minutes. Take about 10 minutes to read and digest and start to discuss the assignment. But ultimately, your assignment is to come up with, so as consultants, you've been hired to help plan a retreat for this organization, for the board and the leadership team. And you want to come up with 3 topics that the board will be addressing during this upcoming retreat. You're going to come up with one that falls into that fiduciary concept of fiduciary governance, one major topic that's around strategic governance, and one major topic that is generative. So imagine that you're planning the retreat and putting an agenda together, and you want one of each topic, or one topic that relates to each. You don't get a lot of information in here. I'm just kind of giving you some background. So feel free to be creative. If you don't know the answers, make them up. If it's like, well, we don't know this about the situation, make it up. Pretend that you know that answer. That's okay. This is just an exercise. And then you're going to appoint somebody to report out on it. So you have a total of 40 minutes to review, consume the information, discuss, and come up with your plan. I will be popping in and out of different groups to kind of listen in and answer any questions. Feel free, if a question comes up, to shoot that back to me in the waiting room or in the main room. Yeah, so everybody have access to does anyone not have access to be able to pull up that link? Anyone struggling with that? All right. Okay, so it's 40 minutes. So it's top of the hour right now. We're going to come back at 11:40 Arizona time. And then I think we'll take a brief break when we come back as well before we debrief. Okay. All right. We will see you on the other side. We're actually going to take a 10-minute break right now. So go ahead and take your break. We will be back at 11:50 Arizona time, 12:50 or 10:50 Pacific, whatever time zone you're in. I think we have some Pacific too. So so we'll see you in 10. Perfect. And do what you need to do. Okay, it's 11:50. Welcome everybody back. I'll know you're back if you're off video, if you can be off video. Right. I know it's hard to be on a video class for several hours, so I like to make sure we get some breaks in. I need them as well. So, all right. So for debriefing, here's what I'd like for you to do, and I probably should have said this. I want you to talk to me as if I am maybe the board chair or CEO, maybe the two of us. So really in reporting out your recommendations,
really play that consultant role. Here's what we're recommending. I'd like to, we'll open up some discussion. I want to go through each of the groups and then open up a broader discussion about kind of what kind of questions you had, what topics you guys discussed. But let's do a first run through with just your recommendations. So I'm going to go in numeric order. I'm going to start with room number 1, which was Antonia, Caitlin, David, Flynn, Karim. Who is your spokesperson?
That would be myself.
Okay.
Very good. Thank you so much. So our group decided on an event structure that will be around organizational direction, focus, and purpose. And established our agenda for this meeting to be primarily focused on generative, the mission structure of the organization, moving through the formalities of the bylaws, and discussing the independent consultant report. From there, we'd like to move to fiduciary responsibilities, going through the roles and responsibilities and the accountability of such by the board of directors as well as the executive team. And then moving to a strategic meeting where we would discuss reestablishing the mission of the organization, discussion around sustainability and branding, as well as move into organizational protections such as D&O insurance, success planning, and establishing a cadence for audits and compliance, as well as discussing the grant and the contract review. Our goal would be to establish how do we preserve and sustain the company and our mission.
That's a lot. Wow. Well, Flynn, tell me what, so what do you think that would be best for our organization to walk away with from the retreat?
Clearly understanding the roles and responsibilities of our board of director and our executive team, and every comfort in those positions and how to execute them.
Okay. When you talked about the mission, help me understand like what you mean. When you talk about like commitment, I can't remember exactly what you said, but help me understand what you mean.
Sure. We have found, given the current circumstances around our organization, that it is a time and place for us to refresh our board of directors' focus and those commitments, and not be fearful of the sustainability of the organization as well as the integrity of the organization. And so with that, our focus will be to establish the direction of the company, the focus of the company, the purpose of the company, by the review of those formalities around the bylaws, the organizational dynamics from the board development and the executive team.
Okay, I think I get it. Anything else that you want to add or share with our organization that you think would be helpful to know?
Not at this time. I think as we move through this event and this agenda, it will become very clear for the board of directors and the executive team to understand the forward mission of all of us as individuals and for the well-being of the organization.
Okay. Thank you. We're going to come back to have a more broader, like open discussion about the experience and kind of some of the things that you all discussed. But so hang tight with some of that. All right, group 2 is Erin, Ashley, Dana, and Gabby. Who's your spokesperson?
I thought
Anyone?
somebody, but maybe they didn't hear.
I'm
I
here,
can
but-
go over it. That's
Is
fine.
it Gabby?
Thank you, Erin. Thank you.
All right, so as the consulting team, we determined that this place seems to be falling apart, and we identified the problems right off the bat. That the CEO, a long-standing company, as the CEO has committed fraud, and it's probably given a bad perception of the company. So we identified that we'd probably need to repair that company image a little bit. We've noticed that the problems are that there is the CEO and the board. Well, let me retract a little bit. The CEO, the new CEO, and the board chair are not playing nice together, it seems. So we determined, we'd have to address that. One thing we really didn't like is that the board chair stepped in as a CEO. So we decided that, during the retreat, we'd revisit some of the problems we'd visit like a code of conduct or an ethics policy for the board to go over with them. And I think someone said it earlier, something they would sign annually to keep it fresh in their minds. So going over that, because when that happened, all the board members dropped like flies. So we'd want to address that problem as well by looking at rebuilding the board. But our topic, Gabby, you might have to remind me, but I think it's rebuilding trust and back to basics would be our topic. So we on the retreat, we'd have a meeting to, that would be like our agenda and our topic. And it falls, we decided we'd want to fall into more of the strategic area, identifying problems right now, like the problems that need immediate attention. And another big problem we identified was the health clinic, whether to start that or not. So we really have to weigh out the pros and the cons. So one thing we'd have to weigh out is there a timeline for this grant? So are we going to miss our window completely if we decide to hold off on it? Because we determined that it's not the best time right now to go for the grant, but we'd still have to weigh out the pros and the cons depending on if there's a timeline. Because if we can get back to basics and rebuild, we'd look at possibly moving forward with going with the grant, because we don't want to damage our relationships with our funders on the government level, and where we get the grants from. It might be a bad look, but then also we might be so chaotic right now that we might not be able to handle it, taking on the grant. So we'd have to, as a consulting team, we'd have to weigh out the pros and the cons. So we didn't fully decide on that yet, but we're leaning more towards holding off on it if we can. But I wanted to talk about, hold on, I just had it up. So this strategic topic, so what's the plan? Like black and white, what's the plan? So our plan would be to have the board chair and the CEO, work out and any kind of issues they have and separate what is going on with decision making. So that way there's no overlap, because as the board chair steps into the CEO role, they might feel like they still have that kind of power. And we don't want the new CEO, I think it was Mary, to feel like she's invaluable or, doesn't have the powers a CEO should have, or she's being overstepped by the board chair.
Okay. Anything else to add?
Team, did you guys have anything else you want to add?
For the last point, as why is it important for the board to have this discussion now? I think that we came to the agreement that it was in review where we at and do whatever we can not to affect the services and the customers that we serve, and they should not feel any impact based on the issues that are happening internally.
Yeah, good points. Thank you. Room 3, Kim, Lance, Nellie.
Yes, I'm the spokesperson. So we kind of took a linear approach, kind of encompassing everything that everybody's already kind of talked about. So we're going to look at obviously the fiduciary, strategic, and the generative. But we wanted to start out by basically establishing or adopting a set of checks and balances. Legally, as us being kind of the experts in all this, we kind of want to define what the mission is. But with that said, our basic role is to kind of educate everyone so they can make educated decisions. And each decision that they do make would be under the consultants or our consultancy's guidance. Once we kind of established the checks and balances, that would kind of help to define the mission. And then from that would help develop the fiduciary understanding, just through that education or educating ourselves of what we can do and what we can't do. So what's the plan? We were going to take an approach of basically starting at the end of this project and working backwards. And with that, that would kind of help define, I guess, our governance plan, or help to kind of evolve that. So if we're starting with an end target, we know that we want to establish, for example, like the clinic or what have you, what is it going to take financially, all the intricacies involved in building that thing up, kind of envision it already being done, but, working backwards in terms of steps to get to that point. And then finally, from the generative question, or what is the question? It's basically the governance plan kind of evolving. I think, as we kind of roll through a lot of this stuff, the key question would probably be, what is it going to take to kind of get all this done at the end of the day? So, Kim, you can kind of jump in this, because I think Ashley, I don't know if she's on anymore.
And we also, as consultants for you, want to make sure that your staff, your board, your CEO are like-minded. They are all on the same page. We feel that there is a tremendous problem and just some discrepancies between what people's thoughts are, how to move forward. So we feel a retreat, especially coming up with a new mission and making sure we're doing this together, might help bring some of that teamwork back to the team as well, because that seems to be seriously lacking.
Okay. Anything else from your group? All right, we got one more to go. Group 4, that was Matt and is it Denise? I think there was somebody else in there, but it's not showing. Sorry.
That was me, Denise, Brett, and Chi.
Got
so,
it.
And I was designated the spokesperson for this group. We actually reflect a lot of what the other 3 groups were saying, but I'll run through mine. You're going to hear a lot of duplication. We decided it would be really important to invite the senior staff to this retreat, to make sure that the senior staff are all also aware and aligned on their roles and responsibilities. We did feel like one of the most important topics was generative, and that was being able to align roles and responsibilities between the CEO, the board chair, and senior staff. And I did hear a couple of comments in there, I think from Aaron, about, since the board chair was serving as the CEO, we want to be able to make it very clear that there's a new CEO here and they have certain responsibilities, and the board chair has certain responsibilities, and the board chair needs to be able to take a step back out of the day-to-day management, so that the CEO can take over. And we wanted to make sure that those 3 things that were mentioned in the article were addressed. So who's responsible for which, addressing strategic priorities, staffing decisions, and day-to-day management topics. So that was kind of our generative piece. On the strategic side, we wanted to focus on the execution of the new grant, and really ask the big question of, is a new health clinic consistent with our mission statement? Is our mission statement accurate, based on the new CEO and board chair relationship? And if so, then does that new grant make sense? And then take that really one step farther in this discussion at a board retreat is, if yes, then how is the board and CEO going to share that vision with the staff to get them engaged? Because it does sound like there's some staff confusion on that direction. So that would be a great discussion at the board level, to discuss, how to share your vision with how a new grant like that would work out. And then on the fiduciary topics, we wanted to again focus on the federal funder, and getting comfort to the federal funder on our ability to meet contract terms. We saw this as a senior staff project, as pre-work for this meeting, for the senior staff to come prepared to present to the CEO and board the current history of the contract, its terms, our ability in the past to meet the terms, and any plans that we have in place to continue to meet those terms. And of special focus was a discussion about how the previous CEO's decisions may have brought that contract into risk, and some suggestions for the board to approve on how to prevent those occurrences from happening again, so that the board could be on board or support those new controls. And I think that was all we had on. Yeah, that would be our agenda. Sounds like a full day.
Yeah, it's a lot, right? All of it is a lot. There's a lot going on with this organization, right? Okay, so let's take a step back. I'm curious about what, taking a look at this situation. Obviously, it would be unusual for an organization to have all of this happening. But when you look at any one element of this, I'm curious what your thoughts are about. Let's take it one at a time. What was the discussion around the board chair stepping into the CEO role? And now we have a new CEO, brand new CEO, who's never been a CEO before. What do you think? I'm curious if there was discussion around that and what your thoughts are about how to maneuver that transition.
We had talked about that in a sense, if we're going to have this new CEO is going to need some sort of guidance. So, obviously we're going to be in the consultant role, but the plan was to bring in, somebody that has experience that could help the CEO make educated decisions before any decisions were ever made.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's a tricky situation. I've been in situations where a board member has stepped into an interim executive role. This dynamic is a little different because this individual has retained the chair position at the same time. When that has had to happen, well, one, I don't advise that it happen at all, but when it does happen, and there are circumstances where it's necessary, I usually advise that they temporarily step down as a board member so that there is no conflict there. And then when they then go back to the board, if they go back to the board, it becomes how do you very thoughtfully and intentionally implement that change so that the board chair goes back to their role and allows the executive the space to assert their role. And so, how do we realign? One of the things I would probably want to focus on is how do we realign roles and responsibilities and get back to normal, if there is such a thing? Because now that you have a board chair who has a whole lot more information about the inner workings of this organization than most board members would normally have. So the temptation might be there to suddenly start micromanaging. So what other things were of interest in the conversation? I heard a number of people talk about the grant. Let's talk about that for a moment. What are the thoughts on the grant situation and the expansion? What were some of the conversations and questions that came up around that?
I think our group's strongest feeling was that we need to establish the organization and the solvency of the organization and its integrity before we can even move to ensuring that a client, grantor, or funder is going to be well served.
Yeah, this is another tricky one, right? You have the money. So now what? Is it the right time? Is it a matter of going back and maybe extending the timeline, or is it something that it should be done at all? So you've got both a generative question around mission and what our organization should be doing, what are the kind of programmatic priorities for the organization? Is this, and then you also have a strategic question about, the implementation, like how would we go about doing it? Is it the right time? And then you have a fiduciary challenge around what are the compliance requirements for this grant? How do we go back and have this conversation with the funder? What will the funder's reaction be, right? It may not be entirely in our control. And I've been in that situation where I've had to go back to a funder to say, I mean, nothing this big, but where it was like, we said we were going to be able to serve this number of clients in, this town or this zip code, and we actually don't have the clients to do it. Now we got to go back and have a different conversation with the funder. So, or when you have a leadership change, sometimes these are things that were committed by a previous administration, and now we've inherited it and we're going, we can't do this, or we didn't do this. And given the fraud situation, where did the money actually go? So there's a lot of things to untangle. Dana, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, so the organization I come from is pretty much 90, I think I did the math, we're like 98% grant funded, or funded to sort of either contracts or grants, things that have an obligation to our funders. So that was one thing I had brought up in our group, and I said, well, what is the timeline? What are the requirements of the funder themselves? Like, even if we as an organization, we're like, we're not sure we can do this, but what does that impact if we go back to the funder? Are they going to be like, well, we're taking the money back and we're never giving it to you again because you fell through with this funding source that you didn't follow through on? Because I know we've had grants that if we ever had to return money, like it's in your contract, if you return the money, you're not eligible for future grants with that funder.
Wow.
Or there's some sort of penalization where you might not be able to apply for 5 years or something like that. So those are things that I brought up, like that would be something to consider for the organization. Like, how is that going to impact the organization in the long run? Is it potentially going to cause more issues in funding if we couldn't follow through with that funding? Because obviously the case study didn't provide all that much detail into it.
No. Right. Absolutely. But these are the dilemmas that organizations are facing. And I've also looked at, sometimes you look at a grant and you think there's just too many hoops. It's not worth the money. I had a organization where we had community development block grants, and it wasn't that much money. It was we got about maybe $10,000 or $12,000 a year from that funding. And as I sat down to look at the reporting requirements, and I sat and had a conversation with our finance person who was going to have to do all the tracking and reporting and receipting, and it was like, is this really worth $10,000 in the big scheme of things? Maybe for a smaller organization it might have been, but my advice was like, look, can we not do this funding anymore? Because it's, we've created all of there's all this administrative burden that goes along with it. So so what other topics were discussed in your groups? Did we hit all the big ones?
I have a question. For the initial CEO who committed the fraud, for something like that, would you need to do a lot of rebuild, like public relations, things like that, like, things to get us in a positive light with the community? What would you recommend?
Yeah, this is one of the biggest violations of trust that there is. I mean, there's others, obviously, but I think this can be a time to bring in a public relations crisis firm that might be able to help you with key messaging. There's always going to be questions. There's going to be donors. I mean, if you have individual donors, some of your organizations do, as I'm looking at the organizations you work for, very dependent on private donors and foundations versus government contracts and grants. But the trust issue is usually going to be your number one priority. If you think about scandals that you've seen, right? How do we rebuild? How do we come out strong initially to say, what's your messaging? Who delivers that messaging? How is it delivered? When I've been involved in these situations, we have pretty quickly reached out first to, we would literally sit and divide a list. We'd bring in senior staff first and foremost, because they've got access to information that the board wouldn't necessarily have. But the board's got to get their arms around what happened, why did it happen, how did the board learn about it, what actions were taken, what's the plan going forward. And oftentimes, let's pull our top donors over a certain dollar amount and draft key messaging and make those calls. Hopefully before the news breaks, if the news even breaks. I've had organizations that proactively sent letters to donors. I remember years ago, the Botanical Garden in Phoenix had an issue, and I remember getting a letter, talking about that, and I was like, well, I didn't even know. And okay, you're taking care of it, great, not a big deal. Other situations, we've managed to keep it out of the press, and keep it internal. But it's not that you're hiding something. It's really more of like, okay, we really couldn't prove it. I had a situation where we couldn't prove it, but there was enough, poor management that the CEO was terminated, but we weren't in a position to say that there was fraud publicly, because the minute we say that, there's also the employment aspect of this. Are you ruining somebody's reputation? And in one of the situations that I was in, we immediately went to the states. This wasn't it was not an Arizona situation, but we went to talk to the Attorney General and Attorney General's office, and is this, given the evidence that we have found, is this something that is that we can bring charges? And sometimes it's really hard to prove, and other times I've been in situations where executives or finance directors or whoever was perpetrating the fraud was actually prosecuted and served time. So my attitude has always been, we're going to prosecute if we can, but we don't always have enough to do that. So messaging is important. Getting some legal guidance is super important. Depending on the size and the scope. If you're government funded, you're making a call to your liaison to say, here's the situation. Because transparency under these circumstances is so important. And what's the leadership that the board is going to take? You might need their help to come in and actually do an audit of the grant. You're talking to your staff to find out what they know, what they don't know. These are really hard situations, but rebuilding trust, getting your arms around the situation, messaging, hugely important. You may lose donors, you're going to lose board members. And you're also going to have donors and board members that, hopefully not the board members, but you're going to have donors that are going to say, we're going to wait and see what happens. So anticipate a period of reduction in financial support. You can see the turnover that's happened. I have often found that when you have an organization that has experienced a significant crisis, you are going to have some turnover. I don't have any specifics on the reason that this interim stopped communicating with the board. Just happened. And the board couldn't get the information. Elements of this come from real situations. The one where this occurred, the board just couldn't get the information, and the interim just stopped responding, and so they had to take action on that. Yeah. What else? So in terms of the fiduciary, strategic and generative conversations, and trying to figure out where things fit. How hard was that for you? What were some of the conversations around, is it this or is it this? I heard bits and pieces of those conversations. Where was the struggle?
I think we had one struggle with, fiduciary meeting with strategic, right? Because we were talking about the grant itself, and whether that was a fiduciary issue or strategic or both. So I think we ended up just putting it in the strategic bucket, but we did have some good discussion about it.
Good. Anyone else?
I don't think that our group was challenged with the placement of these thoughts, only because it seems fairly clear to us that there needed to be some real structure here in defining responsibilities, working towards the space of keeping strategic thoughts and operations at the executive level and in the operational space, and holding the board of directors accountable to their responsibilities and guidance, very much to what you were speaking of, Deborah, of the CEO position, holding them to that space, and ensuring everybody functioned within the corrective space of which they're.
Yeah. Sometimes we have to step out of our roles in crisis, but then we got to get back into our roles. And what, you know, as things, that's part of the stabilization process. And so, but yeah, these things blend together. Nothing's cut and dry. I think you know, again, it depends. That's my motto, is it depends. So there is no cut and dry on this stuff. And that's not really the intention. The intention is for you to, you know, really understand the concepts, and that there's a time and place for discussion. A more advanced board that is in a, you know, is not in crisis might have the luxury of having more generative opportunity for generative and strategic conversation. When I taught this class over the last couple of years, in the first year or two in COVID, it was like most boards aren't going to be able to be in this long-term generative conversation when we're in, you know, crisis management around COVID response, facilities management during COVID, taking care of your employees, dealing with financial challenges that might have resulted from, you know, changes in funding priorities. So there's a time and a place, and so, but these things also do blend together. And the key is if the board is really operating in its true kind of governance as leadership model, there's a place for all three in the work that they're doing. So, all right, well, we have 23 after. So any final thoughts that anyone wants to share on this experience and the case study itself, or takeaways?
I loved the case study. I thought our group really landed in some good discussions around it. For this particular leadership process, I thought it was a great space for the group to be working through that.
And for us, even though you can change the name of the issue that is happening, but all of us can relate to it.
But not today.
Sorry, go ahead, Gabby.
No, that it's interesting that all of us can relate to, at least within our group, we could relate to some level to the case study. We can change the name of the CEO or the situation, but having to manage many priorities and having to make the decision of what can we tackle first, when all of them are important, as we need to execute and serve the people that our clients are today, as we plan for the future and get out of this moment of crisis. So thank you for the experience. Yes.
Prioritization,
I have my topic.
Critical.
I have my topic for my next retreat in December, and I know what are the key elements I'm going to review.
And I think I have just one thing. I'm sorry. Is kudos to Mary for you know, she weathered the storm and hung in there, and you know what, she might butt heads with anybody, but it looks like she was the only one that had the mission and the vision intact. And yeah, there was bumps in the road, but kudos for her for hanging in there.
Well, one can hope, right?
Right.
Some days all you can do is hold on tight and weather it. Yeah. All right. Final few minutes. Here's what I'd like everybody to do just in closing. I would like for you to put in the chat one important takeaway that you got from today, and or one action item that you want to bring forward to your organization as a kind of like one of those like Monday morning action plans, something that you've learned that is actually tangible for you. Just put a thought or two into the chat. While you're doing that, I'm just going to mention that, you know, there is a brief assignment to do before our next class, which is on December 1st. If you wouldn't mind just taking 10 or 15 minutes in between to do that, that would be super helpful. And then you'll have the bigger course project will come at the December 1st class. And I'll hang once you've gotten your thoughts in. Cassandra, is there any housekeeping that you need to mention?
Nothing really for me other than a short reminder that our next class will be December 1st, so 1 week after the Thanksgiving break.
I want to wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving for those who celebrate that holiday. And I will hang for, a little bit after class if anyone has any specific thoughts or questions that you want to talk about one-on-one. Otherwise, I'll look forward to seeing everybody on December 1st.